Hey, welcome back. In our last video, we built the UI for this full stack application. On this video, we'll be setting up our SQL database and web API. We'll be using .NET Core 3.1, Entity Framework Core, SQL Server, and instead of using something like Postman, we'll be using Swagger as a way to test our endpoints, and you'll see how much issue that is. If you don't have .NET Core 3.1, I have a 1-minute video that I'll post in the description on how to download it and install it. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing, and let's get started. Let's go ahead and open Visual Studio 2019 and create our ASP.NET Core web application. So we'll hit Create New Project, select ASP.NET Core web application, click Next, and right here let's call it expenses.web API. Select the location and click Create. Right here, it's going to pop up this little thing. Let's select API and hit create. Okay, so our project got created. So if we click right here on expenses web API, we can see the target framework is .NET Core 3.1. And if we expand controller, there's going to be like a controller by default right here. It's just a template. It gives you some stuff. And if we run this, we're going to see that this should be up and running right now. So there you go. So we get a response. So everything is looking good. Now that we have our project set up, the next thing we're going to do is create our database. And a good practice is to have your database stuff in a new class library. So let's right click on solution, hover over add, new project, go to class library, C#, next, and let's call it expenses.db. And click create. Okay, now that we created our database project, we will be using Entity Framework Core. This is a modern object database mapper for .NET. It facilitates migrations and makes interaction with the database very easy. So let's right click on expenses.db and go to manage NuGet packages. And let's go to browse and let's enter Entity Framework right here. And we want to get the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core and click install. Accept. Okay, next one, we're gonna do .SQL Server. We'll be using SQL Server. So click on Microsoft.Entity Framework Core .SQL Server and click install. And accept. And last one, we're going to be using the tools. This is for enabling command line to create our migrations and whatnot. So click on that one, Microsoft.Entity Framework Core .tools, click install and accept. Okay, close this. In order to use Entity Framework Core, we need to create two things, a model and a context. The model maps the entities and relationships it has defined to tables in our database. Once we have the model, we need to create the context in order to create, read, update, and delete data using .NET objects. With that said, let's start with the model. So let's go ahead and rename this class 1 to expense. Click yes. We'll have a public. And right here, we'll have a key, which will be our ID. Then we can do public int ID. We'll do a get set. This is called property. For those of you that are not as familiar with C#, and you can do Alt Enter, and it'll give you a tooltip right here, and then you can click on it, and it'll just import it automatically for us. All right, so we have the ID. Next, let's do string description. And lastly, let's do the amount. Let's do a double. All right, so we're done with the model. Very simple, very easy. We have an ID, a description, and an amount. That's all we need. Now that we're done with our model, we're ready to create the context. So let's head over to the browser and check out Microsoft documentation on it. So if we head over to docs.microsoft.com/en-us/ef/core, we can see an example right here. And this is the context that they created. They're extending from DbContext, and they have these DB sets out of block and post. These are their models right here, similar to what we created, but we created expense instead of this. So we're gonna have one line, one of these, and then they overwrite this on configuring method, and they're using SQL Server, and this is a string they're passing in, and instead of having the database be named blogging, we're gonna we can call it like expense DB or something. All right, so let's copy this stuff, actually all this stuff, and let's head over back to our code. So let's right click on expenses.db and add a new class. Let's call it DbContext. All right, and right here we can just, actually I'll put it right here. We can paste the code that we just copied, and I'm gonna copy the name, delete this stuff, and Alt Enter, and let's import that. Let's get rid of this stuff, it's not being used. Let's get rid of one of these and change it for expense and call it expenses. All right, and this stays the same, except that we're gonna call this, say, expenses DB. Okay, that sounds good. And save that file. Now let's head over to expenses.webAPI and let's go to startup. And we need to add to configure services our context. So let's do services that add DbContext. DbContext, there you go. And let's add app DbContext. All right, and let's import this stuff. Alt Enter. And yeah, we need to add a reference to expenses DB. We can add it here, or also we can right click on expenses.webAPI. We can go to add reference, and then we can add a reference here. Okay, now Alt Enter again. And then we can do using expenses.db. Save that file. The next thing we gotta do is right click on expenses.webAPI. Go to manage NuGet packages. There's one more we got installed in here. So this is entity framework dot core dot design. Okay, so Microsoft.entity framework core dot design, and click on install. And we need this in order to do our migrations, which is what we're going to do next. So we're going to be using migration to create our generator schema. So let's head over to tools, NuGet package manager console. And right here, we're going to write the following. It's add dash migration space, and then you can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it initial and hit enter. So we'll take a second. And it's saying your target project expense.webAPI doesn't match your migration assembly expense.db. So right here, make sure you default the project to expenses.db, and you can hit the up arrow and hit enter again. All right, and this generates this thing, and we can just double check, make sure this is exactly what we want. So this is primary key, expenses is the ID, and we have our description, which is a string, and amount, which is double. So this looks good to me. So next, all we got to do is update dash database. Click enter, and it said it succeeded. So one way to double check this is you can go to SQL Server Object Explorer, or if you don't have it there, you can go to view. Oh, there you go, applying, and it was done now. Okay, you can go to View and go to SQL Server Object Explorer. So right here, we can open this one, database, and open expenses, DB, open tables, and we'll see our expenses table right here. And if we right click and do view data, we can see we have an ID and description and amount. And this is really cool because we just finished our first migration. We can even use this UI to insert a value in our table. Let's click on the description, delete that no value, and type, say, groceries. Then hit tab, and we can type an amount, say 2025, and we can see how this ID of 1 got automatically created for us. Now we're ready to start working on our controller, and our controller will have the endpoints that the UI will use to be creating, getting, editing, and deleting our expenses. So let's start doing that. Let's delete this weather forecast since we don't need this anymore. And let's rename this controller to expenses. Okay. So let me open this now. We don't need this thing for now. And let me clean some of this stuff up. Delete that. We don't need the logger for now. Get rid of that. And I'm just gonna get rid of all of this stuff. So we have a clean start. Okay, perfect. The first endpoint we're going to be creating is to get all of our expenses. So let's start typing that. So we'll mark this right here as an HTTP GET because we're requesting data and we're not modifying the data. So we're just going to do a GET public, and we'll do an action result. We'll say GET expenses. Notice that the path will be, the route will be, it says right here controller, and this is a special syntax, which means that it's going to have the name of the controller itself. So in this case, it will be expenses. So it will be wherever this is hosted / expenses. So in our case, it will be localhost and / expenses. Now in here is where we're going to return our expenses. It is not of good practice to access the database directly from your endpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new project that is going to be in charge of doing this. So a new project. Let's go over to class library. This is what we're going to create, C# class library. And we're going to call it expenses.core. Click create. Okay, let's get rid of this. Or actually, we can just rename this to expenses services. And let's add a interface. expenses services. It is of good practice to put the I in front of the name if it's an interface. So click add. And now we have our services. Let's add a reference to that project. So if we right click on expenses.webAPI, we can go to add reference and right click, and we can do expenses.core. Click that and hit OK. So let's make this public. And we'll have a few methods in here, but for now we're just starting with get expenses. So let's do a list of expense, get expenses. There you go. Let's import this. And it's asking for a reference to our expenses.db since expense is implemented in expenses.db. Let's do that. Let's get rid of this stuff that we don't need for now. All right, let's save this file. Let's head over to expenses services now. And let's implement that interface. So expenses services. Okay. So Alt Enter and implement interface. There you go. And in here, we have to create a constructor. So let's do public expenses services. And this constructor is going to take an important thing. This constructor is going to take the context. So we need the context in order to access our database. So context, let's create that up here too. Private app DbContext. Context. There you go. So in here we'll say that context equals to context. Cool. Now let's implement this method. And all this method is going to do is it's going to return context that expenses that to list. And we're done. Let's clean this up. But we're done for now with our services. So let me go over what we just did. So our constructor takes app DbContext, and this it basically takes an instance of this, and this is solved by dependency injections. Dependency injections is used to, or we're going to use it to solve our dependencies. In this case, we're going to use it to solve the context for us, and we're using that instance of context to access expenses and then having everything in there to a list. So basically we're returning everything that is inside expenses. Now let's go back to our controller, and in our constructor we want to get an I expense services to expense services, and up here we'll do private expense services underscore expenses services. All right. And we'll do underscore expense services equal to this guy. All right. So now inside this endpoint, get expenses, we're ready to return an OK, which means 200 is successful. And we're going to return get expenses, whatever this method called returns. All right, let's save that file. Remember, to get an instance of iExpenses services, we're going to be utilizing dependency injection. This is very, very convenient since it will resolve the dependencies for us. And to do this and take this into effect, we got to go back to startup, and we have to add it here. So we're going to do services dot transient or at transient, and we'll do I expenses services services. There you go. Save that file. And now let's run our project. So let's click right here, and it's popping up. So it went directly to weather forecast, and we can change this. But remember how I said the path is going to be localhost and then whatever the name of the controller was. So we just need to type expenses, and we can see our only expenses that we have as of right now. Cool, this is really exciting. Next, let's add Swagger. Swagger makes it really, really easy to test our endpoints, especially post and put and all of those, right? That we're going to be needing to test. For me, it's much better than doing Postman by far. So let's add that. It's really easy, like 3 lines of code. I also have a video about it. If you guys want to check it out, I'll put it down in the description below. So to add Swagger, we're going to right click on expenses.web API. And we're going to go to manage NuGet packages, and let's go to browse. And let's type nswag.asp.netcore. All right, we want to install this first one. Accept. Cool. And let's go back to startup. So right here in startup, we want to do services that add Swagger document. And we're going to have settings. And settings that title. Let's set the title to expenses. All right, semicolon here. Cool. and we can add the using OpenAPI and using Swagger right here. So we can do app.use, and there you go, OpenAPI, and app.use Swagger UI 3. Nice. Save that and run your program. All right, pulled up. Let's go to Swagger. And as you can see, this looks a lot prettier. And we can see this is our route, and we have a get. And then we can do try it out, execute. And we get an ID of 1, description, groceries, an amount, and this is an array. And we get a 200 response. So this is looking really nice. Back at our controller, we can implement another endpoint. Let's do one that returns an expense if we give it an ID, specific ID. So we can do HTTP get, and we can get the ID, and let's give it some name. Say get expense. Cool. And here we can do public action result get expense, and we'll get an ID. And in here we want to return the expense based on the ID, meaning we have to call our services. So let's implement that first. So we can go to our interface first, and we're going to return an expense. We'll say get expense. We pass an ID. Save that. And right here in our implementation, let's do implement interface. And this guy is going to return context dot expenses dot, and then we'll do first, and we pass an e dot ID equals ID. So what this is doing is, in the expenses, we're going to get the first one where the ID matches pretty much. Save that, and then let's go back to our controller. And now we can do return, okay. And then we can call services that get expense, and we can pass that ID. All right, one more thing before, I was gonna say let's run it, but one more thing before doing that is, let's go to our properties and launch settings, and let's change this weather forecast to Swagger. That way, when the app launches, it can just go directly to Swagger, and we don't have to type anything in the URL. So now let's run it. Okay, and then it pulled up, and then we can see we have expenses / ID. So if we give an ID of 1, we get our response. Let's go back to our code now and implement creating a new expense. We're going to go to iExpenses as services, and we're going to return an expense whenever we create one. So create expense, and we're going to pass in an expense. And going to the implementation, let's implement the interface, Alt Enter, implement interface. And in here, we want to do context that, and we're going to add this expense. And in order for this to take effect, we have to save the changes. So save changes, and we're just going to return expense. There you go. So that's it. Let's go back to our controller, and let's add a new endpoint. This will be an HTTP post, since this makes changes to data. And we'll do public iAction result, create expense, and we're going to pass an expense. And the creating an expense is a little different. When you're creating something, you're returning 201 instead of a 200, so we cannot do return okay. So let's start by doing var new expense equals to expense services that create expense, and we're going to pass expense. All right, now we need to return a created at route. Created at route. There you go. This guy. This guy will return a 201 for us. And then we're going to name the route that gives us this specific thing that got created, this specific expense. And for that, we're going to use this guy. This is why we named this get expense. So we'll use get expense. And then we'll do a new. And we'll do new expense that ID. Yep. And then new expense. Semicolon at the end, save that, and let's run it. All right, now that it's up, we have the post. So we have get expenses, post, get expense by ID. So if we do this one first, we can see that we only have one as of right now, and we got a 200. Now if we go to post, we can do tryout, and we don't need to put the ID. We can even take it out if we want or leave it. It doesn't really matter. And then we can do credit card, and we can have an amount of $60. And let's hit execute. And we get a 201. This means it got created. And we got an ID of 2. So an ID got automatically generated for us, and it was returned. That's exactly what we wanted. So now if we hit expenses, we get 2 of these. And if we get this guy, we can even get the specific one. So we can do 2, and we get the specific one. So this is really, really, really good progress. This is looking really, really nice. All right, next, let's do deleting an expense. Let's go back to the code now. All right, so back at the code, let's go to add expenses and services. And for this guy, we don't need to return anything. We can just do delete expense, and we can pass it an expense. Save that. Let's implement this. All right, and we want to go to right here, delete expense, and we want to access context, that expenses, that remove expense, and let's save the changes. And this is all we got to do here. Let's go back to our controller, and let's create a new endpoint. It's going to be an HTTP delete. So we public iaction result delete expense, and we're going to pass in expense. And for this guy, we just want to call expenses as that delete expense, and then we can just return an OK. And we need to pass in expense. All right, save that, and let's run it. All right, so let's try it out. And we have 2. So let's go to delete, try it out, and pass in an ID of 2 here. And let's hit execute. And we get a 200. Let's go to get and execute. And there you go. ID of 2 got deleted. Cool. So right now, we're only missing the update, the edit. So let's do that next. So let's go back to iExpenses services and probably want to return an expense, and let's call it edit expense. And we're going to pass an expense. There you go. And back here, let's implement the interface. And we want to find the expense by the ID and then update those values. So let's do, let's do var DbExpense equal to context that expenses that first, we pass that ID equals to expense that ID. So if these IDs match, then we're getting that DbExpense, that expense from the DB itself. And then we can do DbExpense that description equal to expense that description, and DbExpense that amount equal to expense that amount. Last but not least, let's save the changes and let's return our DbExpense. Save that, and let's head over to our controller. This time we're going to be doing an HTTP put. HTTP put. There you go. And we'll do public iAction result. We'll do edit expense, and we're going to be passing an expense. All right, and then in here we can just return okay and do expenses services that edit expense, and we will pass in expense. Save that and let's run it. Very cool. So now if we try this out, remember we had ID of 1, groceries 2025. Let's change that description and the amount. And as you can see, there's the put right here. So let's do the put. Let's do ID of 1. That's the one we want to change. And we'll do student loans. And we'll change that to 900 bucks. Let's execute that. And we get a 200. Perfect. And now if we go back to expenses and we execute this thing, this got updated. Cool. So with this, we have pretty much completed the backend portion of this full stack application. In the next video, we'll be making requests from the front end to our backend and doing small tweaks to get everything working properly. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Like always, work hard and practice as much as you can. And I'll catch you all in the next one.